Hi everyone, I'm Ross Thorburn and today I'm going to be talking to you about the Trinity Diploma in TESOL and specifically the Teaching Practice Journal. So if you're studying the Diploma in TESOL, at some point before you finish the qualification, you'll have to write a Teaching Practice Journal, and this podcast should help you do that more effectively. I'll be giving you some of my top tips for each of the different sections in the Teaching Practice Journal. So these are really just my own opinions, but they're based on really giving feedback to candidates over the years. And a lot of the feedback tends to be simple. So hopefully some of these tips can be useful for you before you start. So before we get into the nitty gritty, just some of the basics for the Teaching Practice Journal. This is related to Unit 4 of the Diploma in TESOL, which is the Teaching Practice section. You'll need to teach 5 one-hour lessons. And after the first 4 of those lessons, you'll need to write a Teaching Practice Journal entry. And although this is called a journal, it's obviously something that is marked. So it's a piece of work at master's level. So it's not really like a Dear Diary type journal. This is something where you're aiming to reflect on your teaching and really show the person reading it how aware you are of what goes on in your own classroom, how you're able to link what's happened in your classes to the reading that you've done on the course, and how reflective you are. So just some general points that I think apply to every section. The first one is just include evidence. So make sure that you include examples of what you saw or you heard or you read from your students that led you to a particular conclusion. We'll be going back to that point several times. Make sure you link whatever you write to what you've read on the course. That doesn't necessarily mean including lots and lots of quotes, but just make sure that you demonstrate an awareness that what is going on in your class relates to what you've read. So as I said earlier, this is an assignment on a master's level qualification. So you really have to write at a level appropriate for that and use the appropriate terminology. And of course, remember that the person reading your teaching practice journal and marking it might not have seen any of the lessons that you've taught. So you need to make it really clear exactly what you did in your lesson. So let's go on to talk about the different segments. There are 10 in total. The first one is a discussion of the achievement of the learning objectives. So again, here it's important to remind whoever is reading what your aim actually was, because they might not have seen your lesson, they might not have read your lesson plan. And you can also talk about the sub-aims, etc. as well. Remember to focus on how you helped your learners to develop their language overall. So it's okay to mention things, I think, like the learners could match the meaning of the new words, the definitions. Let's say that's one stage of your lesson. But to be honest, that's not really saying very much about how their language and communicative abilities have improved over the class. So I think you want to focus on the overall result of the lesson here for the aims as much as for the individual stages, or more than for the individual stages. Make sure you give evidence based on what the aim is for the class. So if your aim was something about giving advice using some set phrases, well, did you hear the learners using these? Did all the learners use these? Did some learners use more phrases than others? What errors did you still hear students making? I think there's room for quite a bit of nuance here. So you really want to avoid just saying, yes, I met all my aims and objectives. Because clearly for different students in the class, it's going to be different levels of achievement. And something else that's worth talking about is just where the learners were at the start of the lesson. Improvement implies people have improved from somewhere. So you can also talk about not really just the final level of attainment of the students in the class, but maybe what errors you might have heard them making at the beginning that they weren't making at the end. I also think it's fair to say that there's no such thing as a perfect lesson, and even if there was, it's highly unlikely that you just taught that perfect lesson. So make clear some of the shortcomings of your class here without going into what could have worked better. There is room to discuss what you could do differently in segment number 8. But just remember that if every learner in your class got everything right and you think you achieved your aims, well, maybe the chances are that actually your lesson was too easy and perhaps the learners maybe knew a lot of this beforehand. All right, so let's move on to the second segment, which is the evaluation of effectiveness of the phonological components of the lesson. Again, here, remind your reader what you focused on and why you chose this phonological point. Obviously, if you're describing what happened in terms of learners' pronunciation in the lesson, you probably want to use some examples of phonemic script. And you want to talk about both what you planned your phonological focus to be for this lesson and also any sort of remedial phonological work that you did. So for example, were there any pronunciation issues that just came up during the lesson that you reacted to and worked on? And if you did, then why did you decide to work on those? You can also say the extent to which the teaching of pronunciation worked. For example, maybe learners improved in pronunciation during the controlled practice, but not during a freer practice activity. So if that was the case, you might want to say that this was partially successful, but maybe you could also comment on why you think this was maybe only partially successful. And since we're being reflective here, you might also just want to think about how useful your phonological focus actually was. I've definitely seen lessons before, and I've done this myself, where I've maybe taught some aspect of connected speech, and by the end of the class, the students maybe don't actually sound clearer. They might even sound less clear than they did at the beginning of the lesson. So you can also state just how useful you feel that teaching of phonology actually was. All right, so number 3 is a justification for any changes to the written plan in the implementation of the lesson. So any lesson includes a lot of improvisation. Really here, you're just saying, what did you change and why? And if you stayed with your plan pretty much throughout the class, which does sometimes happen, then tell us why you did that. Now, I know that seems self-evident, but I think here you want to make sure that you talk about really the students' achievement at different points in the lesson and what led you to believe the students were on track. Just show the examiner that you have an awareness of how the students were doing throughout the class and that you were able to react to that effectively. Again, back up whatever you say with evidence. If you say something like, the students found the warmer activity really easy, well, tell us what makes you say that. What makes you think that the learners thought it was easy? Did they finish it quickly? Did they get all the answers right? What was it in there that made it look easy? And bear in mind again that the person reading this might not have seen your lesson, so explain in detail. For example, I recently read one where the candidate wrote, there were fewer students than anticipated, so I changed some of the pair work to group work. Okay, fair enough, but why was that? Was it because there was an uneven number of students? Or like what made you do that? So I think you need to make it really clear here what your rationale was and why changing something would benefit the students. All right, number 4 is the evaluation of the appropriacy and effectiveness of tasks, activities, aids, and materials. There's a lot of room here to give a lot of detail, and I think it's important to focus on the most crucial parts of the lesson. Obviously here, if you're looking at tasks, activities, aids, and materials, I mean, that's just about everything, isn't it? So pick some of the most vital activities or materials or whatever and talk about how well these match the aims, how well did they help the learners, and why. And again, give details of why you think something worked or didn't. So, for example, if you said that the students were engaged by the discussion questions, well, how do you know? Maybe you could say something like, when you were monitoring, all the learners appeared to be on task. That would be some evidence. Or you might say, at the end of the task, I found that 2 groups kept talking, even when I tried to get their attention back, which was evidence that they were really absorbed in talking about this topic. Obviously, this doesn't prove that they were engaged, but it's some evidence that shows that you've thought about your assumptions. Equally, if something didn't work very well, then this is a good place to talk about that and tell us why you think it didn't work. But I would avoid going into great detail about some alternatives because, again, there's room to do that later on. Okay, so number 5 is discussion and awareness of motivation and learner strategies. So remember here, we're talking about learner preferences. We're not talking about learning styles. Learning styles have been discredited as pseudoscience, so avoid talking about the kinesthetic learners in the class or how you had a visual presentation for the visual learners. Instead, you can talk about how some of the different learners maybe like to learn. So that's preferences. So perhaps Johnny in your class likes to copy down everything on the board, or maybe Kathy is very shy and she doesn't like to speak in front of the class, but she does enjoy speaking during pair work. Obviously, those are made up examples, but I think it's okay to say the names of the real learners in there. I think that's demonstrating to the person reading that you really know your learners well. If you've done a good job with your learner profiles, then this is the place to show what actually happened in class. And I think you can even copy and paste some of your observations here into your learner profiles for the next lesson. So these should be almost like two sides of the same coin. You could see the learner profiles as being what you know about the students before class, what you predict will happen, and then this is really what you did see during the class from the different students. So that was a lot about strategies. The other part of this is motivation. So link what you did in the class to the learner's motivation for learning, and make sure that you give enough nuance here. So, for example, something I read in a journal fairly recently was, quote, the final task was also a conversation that the learners would have in their L1. So it was relevant to them. So on the surface, that might seem relevant, but of course, the things that we do in our L1, our first language, might be different to the things that we do in our second language. So for example, maybe your learners often do conference calls with colleagues in other countries in English, but they don't do that in their first language. So that would make that relevant. But doing something like writing a postcard to their mum who can't read English is something they would do in their first language, but would never need to do in their second language. So really make sure that you relate whatever is in here to the students' motivations for learning. And again, those motivations should hopefully match what you've already talked about in the learner profiles in your lesson plans. Okay, so we're halfway through. Number 6 is the discussion and awareness of cultural, L1 factors and class dynamics. So these cultural factors, again, there could be a lot of interesting things here. For example, you might have found that students from the background that you're teaching, maybe they don't like peer correction because they expect most correction to come from the teacher, or maybe some of your activities were a bit more teacher-centered because that's what your students expect culturally for a teacher to do. Clearly, this is going to be different depending if you're working in a monocultural or a multicultural group. Again, I think this is a great chance to really show how well you understand the background of the learners that you have. And of course, remember that the examiner might not be familiar with that background culture. So for example, the topics you might have chosen to discuss in this class might be related to the cultural background of the students, but make that clear to the examiner because they might not know the cultural background of these students or just not be familiar with that culture. The same with the first language. Again, the chances are that you'll know more about the first language of your students than the person reading this. So it's a great chance to go into that. These L1 factors could be related to lexis and understanding the target language compared to their first language. So this could be to do with syntax, for example. It could be to do with tenses maybe that exist in English, which do or don't exist in the student's first language. But it's a great chance to sort of compare and contrast. Again, this is something that was probably in your lesson plan as well, but you can talk about how this played out in reality. You could relate L1 to issues with pronunciation, for example, first language interference. But of course, this could be positive as well as negative. There might be some things that you find were actually easier for the students to grasp because they were very similar to their first language. You don't necessarily have to be a fluent speaker of your student's first language, but it is useful to do a bit of background reading, which of course you should already have done in your plan. All right, number 7, discussion of the balance of group and individual needs, including differentiations of tasks and outcomes. So this is another great opportunity to talk about the individuals in the class. So again, great to name individual students here. And you could talk about what differentiation you had planned in your lesson, for example, in groupings, open-ended tasks, open-ended instructions, scaffolding. But of course, don't just say what you had planned. That really would just be regurgitating what was in your lesson plan. Say what effect these strategies had on your learners. So for example, a common thing for teachers to say in a plan is, for example, I'll pair the strong learners with the weak learners so they can help them. Now, I'm not advocating for that, but if that's something that you did in this lesson, we'll say how it worked out. Were the stronger learners coaching the weaker learners? Or did the stronger learners tend to do most of the work themselves? Or did they get frustrated working with someone from a different level to them? Say what happened and how successful these different strategies were. In terms of the individual and group needs, these can go beyond the linguistic. For example, maybe you have one student in your class who asks a lot of questions during language presentation, but that's only one student in the class. Well, what did you do for that individual student's needs? And how did you balance that with the needs of the group? Did you answer all the students' questions? Did you shut them down and then come back to that person afterwards? Again, just reflect on what you did and why. I don't think for most of these things is necessarily a right and wrong answer, but this is where you can show the person reading that you thought about this. Okay, so throughout this I've been saying don't tell us what you would have done or would do next time. But number 8 is the discussion and awareness of potential alternative methods, approaches, techniques and strategies. And this is the time when you can talk about what you would do or could do differently. Here you need to show an awareness of different and perhaps more effective ways that this lesson could have been taught. This can really relate back to a lot of the previous points. So for example, let's say differentiation. If you thought that a more open-ended task would have benefited more of the learners, then this is the chance to say that. Or maybe you found that your phonological focus for this lesson, which you had planned, wasn't challenging for the students. They could already do it. Well, this is the chance to say what you could have or should have done differently there. Now remember to cover things at different levels. On a sort of a macro, big picture level, you could talk about how the lesson was staged, but don't just talk about that. You can also talk about individual techniques that you used. For example, how and when you corrected errors, how you group students, and you can also talk about different activities and tasks that you could have used or might have used. Now, even if you thought your lesson was a big success, you still need to discuss here other ways that might have worked equally well. So this is really showing that you understand there's more than one right way of doing things. And before you fill in this section, I also recommend you go back to the previous sections and really just look at what didn't go well in the lesson. And this is the place to talk about how you could have done those things differently. All right, number 9 is a discussion and awareness of how the lesson relates to the teacher's general beliefs. So I think a big part of the Diploma in TESOL course, or really any course at this level, is becoming more aware of why you teach in the way that you teach. And I think this section is a chance for you to show what your principles are. So for example, if you included group work in the class, well, why did you do that? What are your beliefs about language learning that relate to group work? If you corrected errors, well, why did you do that? Which errors did you correct? Why do you believe that those corrections would help students to learn? You don't have to justify everything in the lesson, but I think it's useful to uncover some things that you did in the lesson and reflect on just why you think those are beneficial. All right, the final one is also my favorite, an evaluation of the teacher's own development over the lessons taught so far. So this is an opportunity to talk in a holistic way about how you have developed as a teacher over the course of these lessons and maybe over the course in general. So it's okay to talk about what you have improved on. So for example, my instructions now are clearer than before, but you need to go beyond that and talk about how you've improved. So this is meant to be a reflective piece of work. So think about what worked in terms of helping you to improve your teaching. Think of all the developmental activities on this course. What have you done? You've probably observed your peers. You've kept a journal, like this journal, writing this very journal. You've collected data about your own teaching. You've gotten to know your learners and written learner profiles about them. You've been learning about language teaching through reading. You've gone through lesson planning in a way that's probably more in detail than anything you've done before or since. So how have some of these different activities helped you in your teaching? Talk about that process of learning. So to go back to this journal is meant to demonstrate how you have become an independent professional. So avoid really only focusing on things like my tutor told me to ask more instruction checking questions now, so I do that. Or my tutor told me that my error correction was too teacher-centered, right? Because really, you're not showing that you're independent there. You're showing that you are reliant on a tutor telling you what to do differently. Of course, it is okay to acknowledge your tutor's help in this. But of course, you have developed on this course. I'm sure that's true of just about everyone listening to this. So spell out and really take time to reflect on how has going through this cycle of planning, teaching, and reflecting helped you. And finally, you've written this journal. How has writing this journal helped you to reflect on your teaching? Was this a useful activity? Say, and if you don't think it was useful, it's okay to say that as well. All right, so I hope that was useful. Let's just recap there one more time on those most important tips. Firstly, include evidence for lots of the claims that you make. So describe what you saw, heard, and read for the students that led you to a particular conclusion. So try to avoid saying just the learners were engaged. Tell us why. If you can think about any claims that you make, just try afterwards and answer the question, what makes you say that? Link what you write here to what you've read on the course, so include some references. Make sure that you're writing at a level appropriate for a master's level qualification. And again, use the language of language teaching. When you do this, you're now part of this community of professional language teachers. So demonstrate that in the language and terminology that you use. And finally, remember that the person reading this and marking it probably hasn't seen any of the lessons that you've taught. So make it very, very clear exactly what you did. All right, thanks for listening. If you'd like to find out more information that might help you on the diploma, check out my website, www.TEFLtraininginstitute.com. I've got lots of podcasts on there, which could also be useful for you on the course. Best of luck to you writing your teaching practice journal. Goodbye.